Okay, thank you so much for coming. We are excited to have a panel from our Washington, D.C. site. And this panel concerns an update on the situation of the women of Afghanistan. Let me briefly introduce our three speakers who will speak to this topic from remotely. We have Professor Karima Benoune, who is the Lewis M. Symes Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. She specializes in public international law and international human rights law, including issues related to culture, extremism, and terrorism, and to women's human rights. Professor Benoune served as the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. She has also done a study on gender apartheid in Afghanistan that will be published in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review in November. Professor Benoune will be our first speaker, and then we'll have two others. The second will be Zubaida Akbar, who is a leading women's rights and civil society activist. She has over a decade of experience working inside Afghanistan to promote equality, women and children's rights, and democracy. Zubaida works for Freedom Now and also serves on the advisory board of Femina, an organization that supports women human rights defenders. And lastly, we'll hear from Mitra Mehran, who is a young social entrepreneur and human rights activist from Afghanistan and a former Bush School student. She is one of the 2021 finalists for the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. Currently, she is a non-resident fellow with NYU's Center for Global Affairs. A leading voice in education and women's empowerment, she writes opinion pieces for local and international outlets and speaks to many diverse audiences. Thank you very much, and Professor Benoune, take it away.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be able to be with you virtually, and I'm especially grateful to the conference organizers for including a panel on Afghanistan, which I understand is following on from your conference last year. I want to apologize in advance that unfortunately I have to leave right after my remarks, but I would be happy to answer questions in future that can be forwarded to me through the conference organizers. So I've been working on Afghanistan since about 1996 in a range of capacities, first as Amnesty International legal advisor, then later as UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, working on evacuation of Afghanistan's cultural workers and women human rights defenders, and most recently in partnership with WHRDs, and so honored to be sharing the floor with two of them today. And I've been very frustrated, in particular, I think, since the time of the evacuations, at the lack of effective international responses. And so that's why I wrote this paper, which I'm pleased to share with you today, The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan. And as Dr. Hudson kindly mentioned, this will be coming out in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review later this month. But there's already a short summary of some of the key points that you can find on the website Just Security, which actually my colleague Zubaida Akbar translated kindly into Farsi. So let me start by explaining why I wrote this paper and give you an overview of the argument, and then my colleagues are going to, I think, do more to explain why Afghanistan really fits in this category that I'm labeling gender apartheid. So my goal was really to try to find heightened international responses to make sure that the international community couldn't just walk away from its obligations to Afghanistan, to Afghan women, just by leaving the country. And given the lack of standards on second state responsibility in international human rights law, I turned to the construct of gender apartheid as a means of trying to achieve some of those goals. And I should say that the feminist case for recognizing gender apartheid in Afghanistan was made back in the 1990s. the first time the Taliban took power, by a small number of women's rights advocates from Afghanistan, from other Muslim majority countries, and from around the world, and by one lone UN expert, a gentleman named Abdel Fattah Amour, who was a law professor from Tunisia. And being from a Muslim majority country himself, he understood that Taliban policies were not about religion or culture. They were about political choices, using a particular interpretation of religion as a coercive tool to practice systematic discrimination against women. And this he called gender apartheid. At that time, I think the full international legal case for recognizing this construct was not made. And that's what I'm trying to add to the discussion in the paper. And hopefully, this time, the international community will actually adopt this approach. So, in doing this research, I looked at the literature, I looked at the jurisprudence, but I also carried out a set of 16 interviews with Afghan women human rights defenders from September of 2021 to February of this year. And it was really critical to me that they were not just objects of this work, but really participants in it. I'm going to summarize four of the main points if I have time and do that quickly, mentioning some of the views of those I interviewed along the way. So let me begin with a sort of definitional question. What is gender apartheid? And maybe Afghanistan isn't the only place that we're seeing this phenomenon, but it's sort of the archetypal expression of it. And I define in my paper gender apartheid as a system of governance based on laws and or policies, and the policies piece is also important. A system of governance based on laws and or policies which imposes systematic segregation of women and men and may also systematically exclude women from public spaces and spheres. Discrimination really becomes the governance model here. Gender apartheid involves the systemic oppression of women, defining women, as one of those I interviewed said, as, quote, not as human as men. This really mirrors the experience of Black South Africans under the apartheid regime in many ways. This brings me to the second question. How does the current situation in Taliban Afghanistan constitute gender apartheid? I'm going to leave much of that part of the argument to my Afghan colleagues, but I would mention that the Taliban have, again, as they did in the 1990s, excluded women from most aspects of public life. And if we just focus quickly on two restrictions, they have, as we know, prohibited many women from working, and they've done so in the middle of one of the world's worst humanitarian crises in a country full of war widows. Meanwhile, they have banned girls above grade 6 from going to school, the only country in the world to do that currently. And those who courageously oppose these sorts of policies are abused, as were the opponents of racial apartheid. So I think a new global commitment to ending gender apartheid in Afghanistan could be a way of supporting those women human rights defenders on the ground who are literally risking everything to demand their universal human rights. They are clearly in the lead, but they need thoughtful global solidarity. And I should say that almost all of the Afghan women advocates I interviewed agreed with the characterization of the country's situation as gender apartheid because they found it to accurately reflect the way in which, as one said to me, Taliban policy removes women from government and society. And I think they also ratified this approach because they knew that the apartheid framework had been a key tool in improving the lived reality of Black South Africans in the past. And I think really the idea here is that international law should learn from its successes. That brings me quickly to the third question I want to address. And that is, if we agree that the situation in Afghanistan under the Taliban constitutes gender apartheid as I've defined it, what is the added value of this approach? So, international law already has a robust paradigm for dealing with apartheid, developed primarily between the 60s and the 80s in response to the situation in Southern Africa. It is, however, explicitly drafted to respond only to racial apartheid and has not been formally deployed to address gender apartheid, as I argue it should be. And my point is really that such a feminist transformation of international law, to borrow Charlotte Bunch's concept, is essential in the 21st century and would be the most effective way to respond to abuses in Taliban Afghanistan 2.0, as it's sometimes called. It's perhaps worth reminding ourselves how change was made in South Africa. International political will and local political struggle were essential catalysts for change, and they had a sort of a dynamic synergy. Newly decolonized states played a leadership role, seeing the issue as a vital part of a larger struggle for the completion of decolonization and the achievement of self-determination. The African National Congress was given observer status at the UN and carried out its own successful foreign policy. And, I think it's hard to figure out exactly what was the sort of determinative factor. Many factors converged to lead to change in South Africa. Obviously, first and foremost, a very powerful, well-organized movement on the ground. But I looked at the work of some academics, David Walsh and J.E. Spence, who studied the movements against apartheid, and they concluded in a book with a very simple title, Ending Apartheid, that while it would be difficult to attempt a precise weighing for any one of the factors that contributed to ending racial apartheid successfully, they said, quote, what can be asserted with some confidence is that the changes that occurred in the norms governing state behavior were crucial. Western governments, they said in particular, had to pay at least some deference to these new norms, the effect of which was to give South Africa a unique status, in the International Society of States. And I think this is precisely what we have to do in some way with Taliban Afghanistan, though the country situations and indeed the times are distinct. The most important of the racial apartheid standards was the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which came into force in 1976. And the convention defines apartheid as, quote, inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over any other racial group and systematically oppressing that group. And my argument is very simply that if gender is substituted for race, this is an accurate reflection of Taliban policies vis-a-vis women. And indeed, this concept of apartheid from the Apartheid Convention and the ways in which the international community was supposed to combat it can also be applied to other highly structured systems of control and oppression that are enacted by one group over another on the basis of discrimination. After the end of apartheid in South Africa, the 1998 Rome Statute confirmed that apartheid continued to be a crime and to rise to the level of a crime against humanity. And I'm arguing that we need to employ here an equally vigorous approach to confronting the equally heinous practice of apartheid on the basis of gender discrimination. And my hope is that this can really empower and cajole rights respecting responses from other states and from an international community which claims to value these rights. International pronouncements in favor of equality without appropriate action really discredits the whole women's human rights project. And I think we've seen the impact really being magnified of that discrepancy as a number of states and even prominent international organizations actually participate in gender apartheid by sending all male delegations to Kabul, or even as some move towards normalizing relations with the Taliban, or even to promoting and supporting them internationally, as is the case with a few governments. And I think conversely, the failure to employ a heightened concept like apartheid to a situation like this really sends a terrible message to women in Afghanistan and to women everywhere that their rights simply do not matter or do not matter as much. And in the paper, I also talk about the key legal and policy arguments in favor of the apartheid approach, as well as looking at some of the ways in which this approach could change policy towards Afghanistan, including making sure that the Taliban are not able going forward to claim Afghanistan's seat in the General Assembly. That is the case now. They do not have that seat as they did not in the 1990s. But I am concerned over time that the international community could shift on that. I think understanding the situation there as apartheid would be a very important defense against any such move. And I think it also helps to ensure that the Taliban going forward remain on the Security Council sanctions list as they should, and that there are not exemptions made, including for travel, for those who are participating in gross abuses of women's human rights, including the practice of gender apartheid. And just to conclude, I would say that given the current dire situation in the country, there is no way to achieve progress on human rights other than to concert the efforts of the international community. And I think one of the best ways of doing so is within the framework of global obligations to combat apartheid. And I think very much in closing of the words of Horia Mossadegh, one of those I interviewed for my paper, and she told me the Taliban are known for being a gender apartheid group. There is no space in the 21st century for any form of apartheid, including gender apartheid. And I think what we really need are international strategies to make true the promise of her words. Thank you very much for listening. And again, my apologies for having to leave and not participate in the discussion.
DC, if y'all can open y'all's microphone up for us.
It should be on. But it's by the next, the second speaker.
Do I just go on with my remarks or?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I understood that the expectation from me was to talk about the situation of women inside Afghanistan right now. I am not going to give you numbers and news on the status of women in Afghanistan. I'll share 3 stories from 3 women that I have worked with and interacted with during the past year since the fall of Afghanistan. I'll start with Anisa's story. She's a midwife. She used to work in a hospital before the fall of Afghanistan. When the Taliban came back to power, she was asked to leave her job. Now she continues to offer her midwifery services privately. She faces daily obstacles in doing so because the Taliban have also required Afghan women to have a male minder. The Taliban required Afghan women to have a male minder, a male guardian to leave the house. When she tried to go and offer midwifery services to women in her community along with her husband, Taliban on many instances stopped their car, harassed her husband, who is from the Uzbek ethnic group, threatened him at gunpoint, took his money, his phone, and beat him up. Eventually, Anissa decided that she would continue offering her services, but would go by herself, which there is an obstacle to that too. She has to take public transport, and every time she approaches a Taliban checkpoint, she has to get off the bus, go through the back alleys, and then catch her bus again after she goes through the checkpoint. Otherwise, the Taliban will stop her and harass her. So the Taliban have not taken the rights of Afghan women to education, employment, or free movement alone. They have taken the rights of women to dignified lives. Taliban officials have turned Afghan women into their sexual slaves. Another woman, Elaha Barzai, was forced to marry a former Taliban official who raped her for months. She risked her life to come out and tell her story by recording a video. You may not hear about me after this video, but I would rather die once rather than die every day, she said in her video, which she circulated online. Today, Ella hides in a third country on the verge of being homeless, with no way back to Afghanistan or anywhere beyond the third country. Women have been tortured and killed for demanding food, work, and freedom. As I speak to you right now, Zarifa Yaqubi, a Hazara activist, is in Taliban's prison. Yesterday, they raided her press conference and took her alongside with her 4 colleagues. In September, I interviewed Zarifa right after she had participated in another public protest where she was detained and harassed by Taliban. Taliban whipped Zarifa's colleagues on that day on their breasts and in between their legs and told them, because of you whores, the world is not recognizing us. How are you going to show these marks of these whips to the world now? Women are entirely erased from public spaces. They have tried to pose civic resistances across the country, and they're all alone in doing so. In November 2001, after the US invasion of Afghanistan, First Lady Bush referred to the war in Afghanistan as the war for women's rights. It seems to me, as an Afghan woman, that the same US that used women's rights to glorify its military intervention in Afghanistan now has completely abandoned those same women in the hands of a terrorist group. Because Taliban are the same Taliban. Their policies towards women are also the same. The only thing that has changed is that the US decided to sign a peace deal with the Taliban, disregarding the inclusion of women and marginalized ethnic and religious groups in that process. EU missions, UN missions, and other international community representatives talk to Taliban and post smiling photos with them on their social media. They talk about engagement with the Taliban every day, and they continue to refuse engaging women meaningfully in any of those conversations, which is about women, which is about their rights and their future. In my view, the international community and the way they engage with the Taliban irresponsibly and the way the peace deal was carried out, they have contributed to the systematic erasure of women from the society. I don't have expectations from the Taliban in terms of them being accountable to human rights values, but I do have an expectation from the international community. And I think that by advocating for getting Taliban's gender apartheid recognized in Afghanistan, there will be some hope that we can hold the international community accountable for their way of engaging with the Taliban and for their role in erasing women from the public spaces in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity in platform to talk about the situation in Afghanistan for what it is. And hopefully by the end of the session, we have the participants to ask this question, why collectively we all should do advocacy for recognition of gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Afghanistan, as Zubaida said the stories, you see that Afghanistan is the only country where every single rights of women are taken away from them in a very dehumanizing way, including right to education, right to employment, freedom of expression, and freedom of movement. And if they are sick, they cannot even go to a doctor without having a man to accompany them. And then in terms of their clothing, it's not only that there are certain ways that they should clothe and cover themselves, but Taliban have also authorized their men and family to punish them in case they do not obey certain Taliban's rule, saying that, for example, if women do not obey the clothing rule or the freedom of movement rules Taliban have imposed on them, the men in the family will be punished or imprisonment up to 3 months. And Afghanistan has the highest rate of domestic violence in the world, and it was one of the worst countries in the world to be a woman prior to August 2021. Now, again, Taliban have authorized men in the families to control women. Obviously, if they know they are punished because of certain ways women are dressed, then they beat them in the house and imprison them inside the house and treat them any way they want to, because they are the ones responsible to to them, and accountable to Taliban, not the women themselves. Since they took control, they have issued 40 or more than 40 decrees that limit women's rights in every aspect. The bad thing is there is no constitution, there is no law, and there is no legal means to protect women. So if a woman is beaten or she is even killed, there is no legal mean for her to go and ask for her rights. At the same time, facing bullets and paper sprays and beatings and lashes of Taliban, women in Afghanistan constantly, in small or large groups, go to streets to demand their rights. Unfortunately, Taliban arbitrarily arrest them, torture them, kill them. We face that women's bodies appear on the streets when they want to spread fear. And then there are many women that Zubaida John and I work with that they have been tortured, raped, and even killed in many different ways. And there is no accountability towards them, but we see that as days passed, so Taliban were as a terrorist group fighting as guerrillas across Afghanistan, but they have all the means of power, institutions and states in their control now, and they're using that to suppress and impose restrictions on women in any way they want to. They have limited freedom of speech too, and there is no way we learn about Afghanistan, what's going on in there, and what women are going through. So that's why it's important. And every week, it was the day before that $40 million in cash were handed to Taliban, and that happens every single week. That the international community sent that support to women, to Taliban's government, kind of. Even they say that other organizations implemented, but it goes through the central bank of Afghanistan that is controlled by Taliban, and there is no accountability toward that. And while they're engaging with them without any measures to keep them accountable to the values we cherish as an international world or as a globalized world now. So that is important that the world recognize gender apartheid in Afghanistan. So it gives us legal and policy frameworks in terms of our engagement with them to keep them accountable. That's the first thing. The second thing is women of Afghanistan have been on the streets facing all the bads that we can possibly think. And as Zubaida John said, as we are speaking, Zarifa was arrested with her colleagues yesterday when they had a press conference to talk about women's rights in west of Kabul. So that is important for us, that when we are talking about Afghanistan, then gender apartheid also allow us that they don't limit us to as victims to talk only about women's rights on side events, but talk with women of Afghanistan as power parties who should talk about the structure and the system and whatever happens in Afghanistan, because they are the power now. They are changing the politics. They are the ones on the streets, and they are the ones being whose rights are violated. So that is also important. And the third and the most important thing I think about the recognition of gender apartheid that we call for is allowing us to keep international community accountable when they are engaging with a terrorist group as a state, not as who they are. So that's why I think it is important that for every single woman living in Afghanistan that are treated in a very dehumanizing way, and every single right they have as a human being are taken away from, they should be changed, and that's not possible if we don't have solidarity of the world. And that is, and the easiest way I think for us is recognition of gender apartheid that gave us a legal and policy framework on how to approach it. Now we can get questions from you. Zubaida John and I try our best to answer, even though Professor Karima had to leave. She is the legal expert on that. We do more of the advocacy and information, but we try our best to answer it. If you have any question.
Thank you for such compelling presentations to tell us what's going on in Afghanistan and how this is for women. One of the second presenter mentioned that a midwife was having trouble getting to her patients. And I wonder if there's just some general information on maternal health and how maternal health is being affected by the Taliban. This just seemed one example of, I imagine the midwife, this is very difficult for the midwife, and then I imagine her patients who are left perhaps in labor and delivering a baby without a midwife there.
Afghanistan is has always been a very difficult country for women, and in terms of reproductive rights, it has been extremely difficult. The latest data we had was that every 24 hours, 11 women lose their lives to birth, delivery-related complications, or pregnancy-related complications. Access to healthcare services was always an issue, even during the past 20 years. There were not hospitals in many places or clinics, and there were also cultural barriers to women accessing healthcare facilities. The Taliban's return and them imposing a male guardian policy for women has made this harder. On daily basis, we receive reports from different provinces where women get turned away from hospitals. They are not being treated by healthcare providers because they go to the hospital without a male guardian. So this has made a very terrible situation for women extremely worse than what it was. And I don't know if international organizations that are currently present in Afghanistan are documenting or gathering data on this, on how women are being impacted. But the daily reports that we receive is that access to healthcare for women is further hindered because a doctor won't even see them if they show up at the door of a hospital and they don't have a male guardian.
Thank you. My question is about how the men in society are reacting. I know you already said that their behavior is being directed by institutionalizing punishment for them if they don't enforce rules at home. Outside of that, do you get a general sense of how the men are reacting to the way that their wives and daughters and mothers are now being treated in society? Thank you.
Unfortunately, so before August 2021, Afghanistan was one of the worst countries to be a woman, based on data, and the reason was domestic violence and honor killings, femicide, and many other reasons. But unfortunately, we haven't received as much support as we expected from men, because since Taliban take power in Afghanistan, it's women going on the streets, demanding their rights, getting imprisoned, and all. We haven't their support so far in these demonstrations and protests on the streets. And then one of the reasons they bring is Taliban's treatment towards men are harsher. If a man is, for example, arrested, he gonna get killed definitely, while maybe their treatment toward women is not as harsh. While our experience that we are working with women who are imprisoned and tortured is not the same as it's claimed. But I think Afghanistan is a traditional country with high level of poverty and illiteracy. We haven't received as much support as women of Iran are getting from their men. That's an honest answer, I think. There are families, but the rate of migration to Iran has increased for the families who have girls who are going to secondary education and they cannot attend school in Afghanistan. So they're taking their kids either to Pakistan or Iran, because I think they can either easily get visa or illegally cross the border. So their girls go to school, but we don't have a kind of resistance or a movement inside Afghanistan for this specific reason. And we unfortunately the protesters, female protesters, didn't have as much support as we expected it during their protest and demonstrations.
I think Mitrojan has covered that question very well. I'm keeping my video off because of connection issues. I just want to add that what we have seen in Afghanistan after the fall of the country on August 15th is that many big civil society organizations that had offices and operations across Afghanistan, they collapsed at the moment that the international community and their donor community left. Their executives also evacuated to other countries. What we see happening in Afghanistan is that there are small pockets of civic movement that are being formed, which are mostly women-led across the country. If you see a protest or some sort of a civic activity in any part of the country, you will see that it's initiated or led by women across the country, and that just goes to show that how Taliban's policies are impacting women more than anybody else in the society, and they are reacting to it. They are raising their voices, and unfortunately, because during the past 20 years, the change was not coming from the within, and the work of the civil society, unfortunately, that was happening was not, they were not working on bringing grassroots level change. These pockets of civic movement are very small across the country, and they don't have a lot of support from men, unfortunately. For example, one of the groups that I work with in Kabul, they told me that whenever they organize a protest inside Kabul, even the printing presses or the male-led printing presses are not willing to print their posters because they don't have these movements. They don't have offices. They don't have printers. They don't have resources. It's all grassroots and organic movements. They gather in each other's houses. They handwrite their posters. They mobilize. They meet. They go out on the street, knowing that they will get shot at. They will get killed. They will get tortured. But even the communities refuse to print posters for them. In one of the latest protests on August 13th, a group of them was detained, and they were some men in the community, unfortunately, facilitated that detention. They called the Taliban and told them, here's a group of women who were protesting today, come and get them. So there are many challenges that these women are facing. They're doing this all by themselves, but they're also not getting the support that they need from the international community. For the past 20 years, the entire world poured money inside Afghanistan to support civil society, to promote democratic values. Now, what is left of that is these civic movements that are across Afghanistan. And the international community doesn't even recognize these movements. They call them women protesters, while they are the civil society of Afghanistan at the moment. They are the grassroots movements. And if there is any hope for the future of Afghanistan, it will be on expanding and supporting these movements, both internally, but also support from international community.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question. I feel, in a sense, personally haunted by the withdrawal of the Americans from Kabul in such a shambolic fashion last August. And so I also, am wrestling with the fact that I don't see a clear path forward. Dr. Benune, I think her approach, which is let's expand legally the definition of apartheid to include gender apartheid, is brilliant. I think that's absolutely brilliant. Until that day comes, I think many of us whose hearts are with the women of Afghanistan struggle to articulate what would be effective. For example, should the international community not be giving $14 million a week to the Taliban regime, or would that mean that women would suffer more? Should we not attempt to meet with representatives of the Taliban regime, or should we meet with them in the hopes of convincing them that we really, sincerely care about the women of Afghanistan? And it seems like the women of Afghanistan themselves, while they're protesting, there does not seem to be an effective way for them to roll back some of these dictates of the Taliban. I am sure that the two of you have been thinking very deeply about what this path forward might look like. Can you share your ideas with us? Because some of us are feeling pretty hopeless at this point.
So I go first, and then we can hear from Zubaida John. So the thing is, this is the international community's engagement is happening with no sense of accountability. It's what makes me frustrated every day is how appeasingly their approach is towards Taliban. So $40 million cash boost to Afghanistan, international community, including UN, who are there, can hire 50% women, but they made their female employees resign too, or they are not. The aid workers are not hired. Enough female aid workers can be hired, and they are not. Making sure that the most of the aid is going to the Taliban's member and their fighters, the women who have lost their husbands, who are the breadwinners, they are not receiving the aid they need, and they are suffering too. Or in terms of, the question is, if they are engaging, why so appeasingly? If Taliban are standing for their values, and they know they need this money, they know they need this support, or they are looking for the recognition. The question for us is, when the world is engaging with Taliban, why so alone? Why so behind closed doors? Why they don't face the women of Afghanistan to be present on that table and negotiate what we demand? So the thing is, and then there are many reports the Taliban do not make more than 50% of the population of Afghanistan, and their popularity among the common people are less than 15%. But the question is, world is taking them serious if they are the 15% of Afghanistan, but they are not taking 50 or more than 50, or around 51% of people of Afghanistan who are women as serious as they are taking the Taliban. So the thing is, it's not that women, that the world cannot do anything. There is so much we can do in terms of their engagement, keeping them accountability, ensuring that the aid goes to the right people, but they are not doing it, making sure that women are present on the table when they are doing the meetings in Doha. For example, a special representative of US to Afghanistan, how many meetings he has with Taliban? Almost once a week or twice a week. And how many of them, women of Afghanistan, like us, are present there? None. I was working, for example, for one of these development projects. Even I was sitting here, but Taliban was able to force my office to fire me and force me to resign. I am one of the examples, even sitting in the United States. Now imagine women who are in Afghanistan and working for those organizations, how powerful are, if Taliban can force an organization in US to make such a decision, what happens to women who are trying to sit and work inside those organizations in Afghanistan? So that's why I think there is so much force and leverage that the international community can use in terms of those engagements at this point that they are not. And the second thing is taking women serious and as a power and political force, not as victims that they should help, that they should be like, yeah, this is wrong. We don't need that. I think those women in Afghanistan are proven that they should be respected for who they are, political force on the ground. I think, and making sure they are on the table, that they are not today. Zubaida John, do you want to add something?
I think that was, you covered a lot of that. I think for me, as an Afghan activist, when the international community, anyone from the international community asks me what we can do, I really try to stop myself from saying, you have done enough, stay away, because it's because I want to hear something on accountability from the international community. The situation that we're facing in Afghanistan is not a situation that just came about by itself. Everyone who was involved in Afghanistan during the past 20 years has a responsibility. Those who made peace deals with the Taliban are responsible for the fact that right now it has been over 400 days that girls have not been to school, that women are being tortured for just asking for their right to go back to work. So I think the first and foremost thing that I ask from the international community is to be accountable. It's not just about Taliban's accountability. Well, we hear from the US about about war crimes committed in Afghanistan during the past 20 years, about civilian harm? Are they going to take any responsibility for how the peace process went and the peace deal was managed? Are they going to take any responsibility for the horrible, horrible withdrawal situation and the days in August where everything collapsed and people were behind airport doors? The airstrike that happened right outside of Kabul airport and took the lives of 10 innocent people, including children. Before I ask that anyone, specifically the U.S., to do anything, I would like to know if they're going to take responsibility for their share of the situation in Afghanistan. Are they going to be transparent to us? And next, I think, is can they be transparent to the people of Afghanistan about what the engagement that they have had with the Taliban has achieved? I want to hear from the US if their priority when they engage with the Taliban is counterterrorism and they see Taliban as an ally, or women's rights, human rights, and all these values does matter to them, because I have lost hope and faith. I really think they don't care, because if they do care, there are so many serious allegations of human rights going on in Afghanistan right now that the US has decided to close their eye. There is Hazara genocide, there is targeted killing of Tajiks, there is oppression of women on all different aspects, and we don't see meaningful action from the US or from anyone in the international community in holding the Taliban accountable. When it comes to aid, I hear from the international community, they say, well, the priority right now is humanitarian aid. We need to make sure Afghans don't starve. This is not what the Afghans are saying. You talk to any Afghan these days, they say, we are okay that we are hungry, but we don't want the Taliban recognized. We don't want the Taliban normalized. No one aspires to wake up in the morning and stand in a long line to get a bag-infested grains from WFP. Trust me, no one wants this for their life. I was a child and I stood in a line to get a piece of bread from IRC distribution. And now I'm a grown-up and I see young children doing the same, going through the exact same thing. Why does the international community think that if you're Afghan, if you're Muslim, if you're brown, this is your fate? You either live in conflict, or you stand in lines for a piece of bread or a bag of infested grains, or there are bombs that we drop on you. I think that I don't look as an Afghan who has served in Afghanistan for the past 20 years for many USAID projects. I don't see the US as a strategic ally anymore. I can't trust the intentions of the US for Afghanistan anymore, because there has never been accountability. The relationship has always been extractive and one-sided. And even now, no one tells me when Thomas West sits and talks with the Taliban, what do they talk about? I'm still excluded from this process. So I think the first and most important thing that I ask is that for civil society in the US, for people who care, to hold your government accountable, because the cost of their militarism and their military intervention is this. There are 36 million people in Afghanistan who are now in the hands of a terrorist group, and 100K who were evacuated and their fates are unknown. They don't have proper documentation. They have lost everything possible. This is not allyship. This is not support. This is not standing for democracy and human rights in no way. And I also want to say that would it be acceptable for any of you here that your daughters cannot go to school for 400 days for no absolute reason? Would you be okay with it? Or do you think that as long as this is happening to some Afghans, to some Muslims, some brown people on the other side of the world, that it's okay? It astonishes me that the world is silent about something like this. 1 year, our daughters have been deprived of their most basic right to education, and there is nothing about this in the international media. So I don't have a lot of hopes and international and expectations from the US, from international community, but I hope that someday that there is accountability, that they at least respond to me about what they have done in Afghanistan for the past 20 years. When I hear that, then I'll trust their intentions and I'll tell them what's next.
Even know if they can hear me without this. I just wanted to thank all of our panelists, Metra and Zubaida, who have spoken to us. We are very grateful for your words. We're now going to turn the time over to another speaker,